And this is one I get asked about a lot, or I have been over the years. I've gotten questions from a lot of listeners in the UK who are always asking me, when is WWE going to run a WrestleMania in the UK? Or why haven't they come back to the UK for a big show? Well, this question comes from Maddie in the UK. Triple H gave an interview. Boy, Triple H gave a lot of interviews this week, didn't he? He gave an interview to The Mirror this week talking about why WWE has not brought a WrestleMania to Wembley Stadium or been back to Wembley for a big show since SummerSlam 1992. He talked about the difficulty with the time zone difference and also said that they haven't come back because the show was not a success. Do you buy this as an excuse? No, I don't. And I'll tell you why. In the interview that Maddie is referring to, and I read the interview, this was Triple H's full answer to the question. I just want to make sure I'm giving the full context here. He said the time zones are the big kicker. We have to go where the most people can watch. I always hear about Wembley. I always hear about how it was this massive success. It was not. From a business standpoint, it was not. That's why we haven't been back, and that's why we're still trying to figure it out. But when the time is right, absolutely. So we finally get some semblance of an answer here. Two reasons. Number one, they haven't been back, A, because of time zones, and B, because he claims that the first SummerSlam in Wembley was not a business success. So let's break this down here, because he claims the event wasn't a big success business-wise, which I think is a little misleading. They sold out Wembley Stadium, legit. 80,000 fans, still one of the biggest crowds, legitimately biggest crowds, real number, that WWE has ever done to this day. And even in this article here, they quote the promoter of the show in the article, the guy, Martin Goldsmith is his name, and he says they only had a few newspaper ads and a little bit of promotion on Sky, and they were able to sell that show out. So put that on the side, right? They did over £1 million in merch money on that show. Just for that show alone. That's a lot of merchandise. Now, what I think he's referring to, because he didn't specify this, but what I think Triple H is referring to is the buy rate for the show. And you can look up old pay-per-view buy rates online. It's very easy to do. The buy rate for that show was not great. It was not considered great. It was down from previous years. But you got to remember, this show did not air in the U.S. for another 2 days. The event was on August 28th. It did not air on pay-per-view here in this country until August 31st. So that's number one. Number two, this was the first WWE pay-per-view, I believe, since that modern age at that time of pay-per-views, that did not have Hulk Hogan on the card. That would have been the first pay-per-view to not have Hulk Hogan on it. Although, to hear Hogan tell it, he was on the card that night, looked out into the crowd and saw an empty seat where he had given a ticket the day before to a little Hulkamaniac with cancer. And he knew at that moment when he saw the empty seat that the child had died, and so he wrote a song for him called Hulkster in Heaven. I'll never get tired of telling that story, by the way. So I guess there was some rip in space and time, and in some alternate dimension, Hulk Hogan did in fact wrestle that night at Wembley Stadium. Here on Earth 1, he didn't. And that was the first pay-per-view that he didn't wrestle on for WWE up to that point. That was a big deal. Hogan was still, you could talk about how the fans were starting to boo him and stuff, but Hogan was still a draw. He proved that when he went to WCW a couple of years later, and they did very well. They did very good pay-per-view business with Hulk Hogan. So, no Hogan. Ric Flair, he was on the show, but he didn't wrestle. There was no promoted match even for Ric Flair on that show, bizarrely enough. They had a double main event, both matches, babyface against babyface. So I think it's misleading because he makes it, you hear that and it's almost like, well, it didn't do good business-wise because we just didn't sell tickets or whatever. That's not true. It's misleading to say that. There are lots of reasons that you could point to why SummerSlam that year did a poor buy rate and didn't do well in that regard. None of which have to do with time zones. Like today, for example. If they did a show from a different time zone, and they do that a lot now. I mean, I just woke up for a friggin' Australian show at 6 o'clock in the morning about a week ago. So now they do, with the network, they can do stuff like that. But today, if they do a show from a different time zone, they wouldn't wait 2 days to air it. It's not airing 2 days later. So yeah, there's a time zone difference, and it's kind of a bitch. But you can make it work. Let's just be honest about why the UK fans have not gotten to WrestleMania so far. He wouldn't say this in the interview, so I'll say it. The reason that the UK have not gotten a WrestleMania yet or another big show like that is because they won't pay them for it. You know goddamn well that if the Brits threw a bunch of money at WWE the way that the Saudis did, or the way that other cities do when they bid for WrestleMania, I mean, at least as far as like tax breaks or some other kind of incentive, that they would be there in a heartbeat. You would have had a WrestleMania from the UK years ago if that were the case. They can cry about time zones all they want to, but it's just an excuse. If you put together a card that people want to see, they will pay for it. And I'm not even sure that matters today, honestly, because all these shows are on the network. So if you want to know when the UK is going to get a WrestleMania, they'll get a WrestleMania when London makes it worth their while and not a day sooner than that.